Wars are considered the world's biggest crisis. Decision taken in moments of crisis can change everything. Sometimes one decision can influence world history. In the war between Russia and Ukraine, there was a very unusual development. This event could change the course of the war. This extraordinary development has received considerable coverage in the Ukrainian press. The information we are receiving from the frontline shows that everything has changed. Before we talk about this extraordinary event, we would like to give you a small reminder. Our team has been working day and night to prepare these reports. You can contribute to independent journalism by supporting our team of experts. You can support our team by using the Super Thanks button below the video. The war between Russia and Ukraine is, in every respect, the most interesting war in history. Hundreds of articles will be written about what happened in this war. There are two things that make this war so special. First, it was the first time modern weapons of war were used. Modern radar systems, artificial intelligence-powered defense tools were tested in this war. But there was a more important weapon of all drones. Bayraktar drones used by the Ukrainian army have completely changed the course of this war. Thanks to these drones produced using the most advanced technology, the Ukrainian army gained a great military superiority. Thousands of Russian tanks were destroyed by these drones. The Russian army could do nothing against the drones. The other thing that made this war special was its importance for world history. Not since the Second World War had there been such an open confrontation between the Eastern and Western blocs. Russia started a war to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. As a result of this war, NATO members sent large amounts of aid to Ukraine. NATO weapons were used against Russian weapons. International political balances became very important in this war. The Russian army was in very bad shape since the beginning of the war. About 150,000 Russian soldiers have died. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been wounded. But there is something much more important. Thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Some of the surrendered soldiers returned home. Others remained in Ukraine. Today's Ukrainian media reports were about these soldiers. Allegedly, the surrendered Russian soldiers decided to fight against the Russian army. And how could this happen? The Russian army is one of the largest in the world. It includes people from many different nationalities, but the vast majority of these soldiers do not support Putin's policies. After Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, many soldiers in the Russian army were very angry because Russian citizens and soldiers did not support this invasion. According to polls conducted in Russia, 65% of the people do not support Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It is estimated that this rate is higher in the army. In addition, Putin recruited another 300,000 Russian citizens after the mobilization decision and sent them to the war zone after a short training. The vast majority of these soldiers did not want to fight. Moreover, they were very angry against Putin, who sent them to this war. Russian soldiers started mutinies on all fronts. Russian commanders used very harsh punishments to put down the mutinies. Some Russian soldiers tried a different method. The Ukrainian government was well aware of the Russian soldiers' reluctance to fight. That's why it encouraged Russian soldiers to surrender. A special hotline called I Want to Live was set up for Russian soldiers to surrender. The Ukrainian army was assured that the safety of all Russian soldiers who surrendered would be guaranteed. This plan of the Ukrainian government worked and thousands of Russian soldiers decided to surrender. The surrendered Russian soldiers were first given hot meals and clean clothes. These soldiers were allowed to meet their families. Then the soldiers were interrogated. During this interrogation, Russian soldiers told everything they know about Putin's war plan. In this way, the Ukrainian army managed to decipher all of Putin's plans. Some of the Russian soldiers who were interrogated were very angry with Putin and their commanders. When the soldiers saw the hardship that the Ukrainian people were going through, they were very upset. They felt that this war must end as soon as possible. A group of surrendered Russian soldiers made a very brave decision. These soldiers decided to fight against the Russian army. According to Ukrainian media reports, these soldiers are fighting against Putin's army in Bakhmut. According to the allegations, this unit consists of sniper soldiers. The snipers focus on killing officers and commanders in the Russian army. In this way, they are planning to withdrawal of the Russian army from this region. The fighting in Bakhmut has been going on for a long time. The Ukrainian army is showing great resistance in this region in its address to the Russian people. Putin said that Bakhmut would soon be captured by the Russian army. The resistance of the Ukrainian army foiled Putin's plan because of this failure. Criticism against Putin is constantly increasing. Putin is very angry because of this criticism. Putin ordered Russian commanders to seize Bakhmut as soon as possible. The most elite units of the Russian army are being sent to Bakhmut. It is also reported that troops of the Wagner Group are being sent back to Bakhmut. According to Ukrainian Defense Ministry reports, more than 5,000 Wagner soldiers are estimated to have died in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army is protecting this town with its best-equipped soldiers. The 17th Tank Brigade, made up of the most experienced soldiers in the army, is defending this town from occupation. The brigade's battalions used about 100 upgraded Ukrainian-built T-64BV tanks from the Cold War era, with fast automatic loaders for their 125mm squared main gun. These tanks were equipped with modern optics by the tank factory in Kharkiv. The Ukrainian army is making great efforts to completely remove Russians from these cities. Ukrainian officials emphasize that modern tanks are needed to be better protect these cities. After the arrival of Leopard 2 tanks in Bakhmut, the Russian army is expected to suffer another heavy defeat. The Ukrainian army needs more weapons to protect Bakhmut. So why is Bakhmut so important? The Russian army has been trying to reach Kiev since the beginning of the war. Bakhmut has a very strategic position for the highways in Ukraine. After capturing Bakhmut, the Russian army wants to take tanks to Kiev via the highways. The Russian army needs to occupy Bakhmut first to capture Kiev, but the Ukrainian army manages to protect Kiev and Bakhmut by showing a historic resistance. What do you think about Russian soldiers fighting against Putin's army? How do you think the fighting in Bakhmut will end? What do you think about the historic resistance of the Ukrainian army? What do you think about Western countries sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine? Do you think Western countries are supporting Ukraine enough? The Black Sea, one of the most critical corners of the war, has been shaking with a hot agenda for the last month. The loss of the Russian Navy and the decrease in its dominance in the Black Sea show us that they will face much greater threats. The appearance of the NATO Navy in the Black Sea and the landing of US warships in the Black Sea caused a red alert in the Kremlin. Let's follow the latest developments in detail. We all know that a weakness that the Russian Navy will experience in the Black Sea will make Crimea, the most critical region of the war, vulnerable for Russia. Let's start. Russia had a stronger and more advantageous army compared to the Ukrainian forces. However, it lost its power and advantage over time, except for the first period of the war. Russia could not use its large army, the patriotism of the Ukrainians, and the modern weapons of Western countries had a great impact on this situation. Western countries continue to support the Ukrainian forces, and they give the message that new support packages are being prepared for Ukraine. Western countries' pressure on Russia with sanctions and modern weapons continues. Even the United States began to take more concrete steps. The United States deployed a warship in the Black Sea so that the Kremlin would feel more pressure. This event took place for the first time since Russia started the invasion plan of Ukraine. For the first time since the start of Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, a U.S. warship entered the Black Sea. The guided missile destroyer USS Nietzsche has arrived in a Turkish-Portuguese. The American destroyer first docked in the Greek port of Piraeus. The ship then visited Turkey while the U.S. warship was in Turkey. US Consul in Istanbul, Julia Eder, and U.S. Ambassador Jeff Flake visited the ship. During this visit, Julia Eder stated that the ship's existence is linked to Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. USS Nietzsche is part of the George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group operating in the U.S. 6th Fleet Operations Area. The Nimitz-class aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush CSG-10 is the flagship of the George H.W. Bush CSG. The presence of the U.S. warship in the Black Sea during the Russo-Ukrainian War indicates that the hegemony of the Russian forces in the Black Sea was largely destroyed. The last visit of the United States Navy to the Black Sea took place in 2021. The destroyer USS Leopard was the last U.S. warship to leave the Black Sea and pass through the Bosphorus in December 2021. Before Nietzsche's visit to the Black Sea, two ships of the United States Navy attempted to approach the Black Sea. The destroyer USS Bainbridge visited Axos, which is closer to the Dardanelles, in July 2022. Another destroyer, USS Mitchell, also visited Axos in March 2022. The reason why the USA did not visit the Black Sea for a long time is because they thought that this move would escalate the war. But as we have seen recently, Russia has lost a great deal of dominance in the Black Sea, and the United States does not think that the Russians are likely to escalate the war. Russia has not won any wars against Ukrainian forces. Russian forces are trying to pierce the Ukrainian defense with ground attacks, but the Ukrainian forces do not allow the Russians to succeed. The Kremlin army is constantly losing power. Although there was no continuous conflict, Russia lost the most power in the Black Sea. The wrong war strategy, followed by the Kremlin government, deeply affected the Russian Black Sea Fleet. At least 18 ships and boats of the Russian Black Sea Fleet were sunk or fatally damaged after Russia's full-scale invasion plan began. This means that it lost close to 25% of its pre-war combat power, which consisted of 74 ships and boats. An interesting detail is that in 1990, the Russian Black Sea Fleet consisted of 800 ships, 274 of which were warships. But then it began to decline sharply compared to the Soviet Union era. It is seen that the Russian forces had 5 times fewer ships when the Ukrainian War began. Russia's total ship composition decreased threefold. The Black Sea Fleet, together with patrol boats, had 74 combat units by February 2022. Compared to Russia's past and present, everything is terrible for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. At the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, Russia had 6 diesel-electric submarines, 6 large surface ships, including a missile cruiser, 36 other ships and support vessels in the Black Sea region. In January 2022, Russia reinforced additional forces from the Northern, Baltic and Pacific fleets to the Black Sea and Mediterranean under the pretext of the exercise. 6 landing ships went through the Black Sea, others remained in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the start of the war, the Ukrainian forces had a very, very small navy. After the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, the Ukrainian Navy lost its ships and had to move its main base to Odessa. Ukrainian forces had no claims in the naval area. Despite this, Russian sailors lost the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Project 1164 Moskva missile cruiser, to a country that did not have a navy as a service arm. As we just have mentioned, Russia's loss of dominance in the Black Sea is due to the Kremlin's adoption of wrong war strategies. With the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the main base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet became the port in Sevastopol. Russian forces were putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine, thanks to this Portuguese, but the Russian army was not protecting this port well enough. Russia's main base in Sevastopol is not equipped with modern electronic warfare systems and radars for detecting naval and air drones. Ukrainian forces made good use of this vulnerability and struck the heart of the Russian Black Sea Fleet with drones. Many ships in the port were badly damaged. After annexing Crimea, Russia promised to modernize Moscow. For this reason, the Russian missile cruiser Moskva was sent to the docks for 3 years. However, instead of a complete modernization at the shipyard of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, only the engines were repaired and Moskva continued to operate with the old air defense systems. As you know, the Russian missile cruiser Moskva was shot down by the Ukrainian forces using the Neptune missile. The Kremlin did not accept this and stated that Moskva sank as a result of fire. The experts who repaired the flagship stated that the ship was in a deplorable condition. According to them, the antenna in Moscow later rotted and the lower part of the ship was rusted, thus punctured in some places. At the same time, the Kremlin government still did not admit that the crew had died at the time of the sinking of Moskva. There were between 400 to 680 sailors in Moskva, and probably all of them died, according to Ukrainian intelligence authorities. And intelligence agencies are forcing the families of Russian sailors to withhold information about the sailors who died on the cruiser. Many of the ship's crew are still considered missing. Moskva, one of Russia's most important ships, was buried deep in the Black Sea, never to be used again. And the Russian Black Sea Fleet was badly damaged. While changing the balance of power on the northern shores of the Black Sea became a major focus of attention. While the Black Sea is in great demand, there are several scenarios that can be experienced in the Black Sea. In the scenarios we encounter, the key role is always Turkey's. In the first scenario, Turkey, which maintains its skillful bureaucracy between the parties, can be effective in the peace process. It could hasten the ceasefire between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Russia's war crimes and unlawful attitudes in Ukraine indicate that this process will not provide continuity and will lead to worse results. In the second scenario, in the event of a prolonged war in Ukraine, the US pressure on Turkey to comply with NATO's sanctions regime may increase NATO pressures, negatively affect agreements between Ankara and Moscow, and this issue may cause problems in Syria. The policy that Turkey will implement may lead to the collapse of today's fragile balance. The probability of this scenario occurring is quite high, considering today's conditions. Except for the first period of the war, Russia could not use its large army. The patriotism of the Ukrainians and the modern weapons of the Western countries had a great impact on this situation. Western countries continued to support the Ukrainian forces. As long as this support continues, Ukraine's victory seems very close. Vladimir Putin has realized that he will lose the war at any moment. It is reflected in the intelligence reports that the Russian ports in the Black Sea are on the alert. However, they do not seem to be able to prevent Ukraine's attack on Crimea, which will unlock the war no matter what. There is a lot of news from the Donetsk region. Ukrainian, British, and American intelligence all agree that the Russians plan to launch their great offensive operation by the end of this week. By that time, the Russians expected to create chaos on the front line by collapsing the Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut or somewhere else. However, the Russians got stuck in front of several key Ukrainian positions that threatened to undermine and completely ruin all Russian plans in an attempt to meet the deadline. The Russian command ordered to assault absolutely all Ukrainian positions in Donbass non-stop. But here is how translated to the fronts when it comes to the Avdiivka region. Last time I told you that the Russians surprised the Ukrainians by launching an attack across the frozen water, which allowed them to assault the weakest point in the Ukrainian defense line and establish control over the eastern part of the settlement. For the next 3 weeks, the Russians have been trying to expand to the north and west, but as usual, incremental advancements in the object direction are extremely slow. Russian sources reported that their capabilities in this region were being limited by intense Ukrainian artillery fire. On top of that, if you look at the topographic map, we can see that there are 2 hills in front of this settlement. This is exactly where the Russians tried to move in as fast as possible as part of the Avdiivka encirclement operation. However, due to the hills, extensive trenches, closeness to the main supply hub of the Avdiivka group, the fact that the Ukrainians allocated more troops to stabilize the front line, and no element of surprise, the Russians did not manage to breach the next line of defense and got stuck. Today, the Russians developed a new plan and launched intense assaults along the whole of Avdiivka front. They attacked Ukrainian positions in Pervomaisk, Kamyanka, and in front of Volhynia, Opitin, and even Avdiivka itself. Judging by the direction of attacks, it is clear that they did not plan to breach Ukrainian defense somewhere else. The main goal of the Russians was to disperse Ukrainian troops that they concentrated near Sivny. This is a very costly tactic because attacking Avdiivka in front is simply a suicide mission. But the Russians can afford it, as they have been relocating a lot of mobilized soldiers to Donbass. One of the things that the Ukrainians can and are doing to not allow the Russians to use all their resources is creating logistical problems by conducting constant HIMARS strikes, by continuously destroying ammunition depots that are close to the front line. They are creating short-term deficits and forcing the assault units to ration and save ammunition until the next supplies arrive from the deep reserves. Today, the Ukrainians conducted yet another strike and destroyed an ammunition depot in Donetsk at the former cinema building. Since the last coverage of this region, the Ukrainians have consistently targeted the main logistical hubs and bases in the region: Ilovaisk, Kharkiv, Makiivka, and of course, Donetsk. When it comes to the Volodar area, the Ukrainians regained the initiative. Last time I told you that the Ukrainians had successfully pushed the Russians out of the eastern hamlet and that the Russians also unsuccessfully assaulted the coal mines. I also told you that the Ukrainians in Volodar assumed more of a passive position, being in pure defense, while most attacks were conducted from the coal mines area. Right now the situation has improved even more and the Ukrainians in Volodar have become more active. The Russians are not giving up and they continue to throw their forces to attack the eastern hamlet. These attacks must be launched across the field, which is why the Russians started to use the following tactic. They sent a lot of small infantry groups to get as far along the tree belts as possible, and then they sent several infantry fighting vehicles under cover of smoke to establish their positions even closer. So far, it has been a one-way trip. The Ukrainians just overwhelm them with artillery fire and then in one thrust, eliminate the rest. Russian sources confirmed that the number of Ukrainian counterattacks has increased. Ukrainian sources report that Russian forces lost up to 30 armored vehicles during the counterattacks and associated strikes. Some sources recently posted footage and imagery confirming Ukrainian strikes and counterattacks. Overall, the Russian command likely ordered to continue to assault Volodar, despite the fact that it looks like they ran out of viable tactics as the Russians relocated tens of thousands of mobilized troops to the front. They can clearly afford high losses. The main goal is to bridge the Ukrainian defense at least somewhere. It is necessary for the Russians to collapse a segment of the front line because it will force the Ukrainians to use up their reserves in an attempt to stabilize the front line. Once the Ukrainians have no available reserves, the Russians want to launch their main offensive operation. But so far Volodar, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and Siversk continue to hold. While the Russians are running out of time to launch an offensive before the rainy season, the window closes steadily, which forces the Russians to sacrifice thousands of troops skilled and wounded per day just to set proper conditions for their long-awaited offensive operation.